Private equity doesn't always have the best reputation, but private equity comes in many different shapes and sizes. Today on the show, we have an experienced GovCon operator who, after building and selling his own companies, has joined a private equity firm called Foxstead Partners with the goal of helping small GovCon companies grow their capacity and value. Today on GovCon M&A Talk, we are joined by Dyson Richards of Foxstead Partners. This is GovCon M&A Talk, presented by Orange Slices. I'm Sharon Heaton of sbLiftOff, and I live and breathe GovCon M&A. So let's talk deals. Dyson, thank you so much for joining us today.
So glad to be here. Good to see you, Sharon.
Well, you have a heck of a story. You and I got together a couple of weeks ago, and I listened to the story and I said, oh my gosh, I must put you on the podcast. Tell me about, back when you started in GovCon, back at the Stone Ages of the 1990s, when GovCon was really beginning to come into its own. How did you get into the industry?
Well, I showed up in Crystal City in 1991 after spending 8 years in the Navy. I was on an aircraft carrier, got out of the Navy in 91, and my first job was really taking my uniform off, putting a business suit on. This is back when we wore ties and jackets to every meeting, and I worked for Newport News Shipbuilding. So I really kind of did the same job just from the civilian point of view. And I was in Crystal City. That's back when NAVSEA used to be headquartered in Crystal City, and I was helping them to acquire submarines and aircraft carriers. So that's where I first learned about growth and proposals and timesheets and managing deliverables, all those things that I didn't learn when I was in the Navy. It really gave me my first exposure to government contracting.
How long did you stay at that first position?
I was there about 3.5 years, and I actually made a big change. So Newport News Shipbuilding at the time was owned by Tenneco, which was a 100,000 person company. So it's kind of like being in the Navy, large organization all over the world. And then I ran into a small business called RGS. And the founder of RGS is a gentleman named Richard Stiglitz, or Dick Stiglitz is what he went by. And we met in a meeting about it, the Navy Seawolf submarine, and he asked me to lunch. And that turned into an interview, that turned into a job offer. So I originally turned him down. He very forcefully said, Dyson, that's the wrong answer for you. And I was like, okay, tell me why. And he said, because I can make you into a GovCon leader, right? In a small business, they had 15 employees at the time. I learned everything. I learned about finance. I learned about proposals. I learned about service delivery. I learned how to manage a team. And it's really where I got my education in how to be a GovCon operator.
Let me ask you this. Everybody keeps on saying GovCon has changed so much over the years. In your experience, has there been a lot of change from the early 1990s to where we are in 2026?
Certainly, yeah, hundreds of them. I mean, we could spend the whole hour talking about that. Really when at this time, so this is now 1994, the customers I was serving, I was going there with file folders full of paper and sitting down with them in a conference room and talking through what we were going to do to build an aircraft carrier. And then slowly over those early 90s, I started to see my customers get these putty colored boxes on their desk, and they had no idea what they were for. They were basically fancy typewriters in their mind. So instead of whiteout, they could use backspace to correct a typo. So really, I was there at the beginning when kind of that became the platform of choice to improve the efficiency of the federal government. I didn't know anything about computers. I mean, I'd seen one before. I kind of used it like a typewriter. But over the last 30 years, I've not become a computer expert, but I've certainly become an aficionado of technical solutions that increase the efficiency of an operation. From first connecting printers, so you could print something out, to today with AI and all the things that we're doing for our customers today. It's really changed the way government operates.
It sounds as though you were there at the beginning of the computer era, and somebody joining GovCon today is really starting at the beginning kind of the AI era. And who knows how that will follow for the next 20 or 30 years.
Absolutely.
Got it. Okay, so you were at this small company. Dick, Wasn't he also an author? Didn't he write some books?
Yeah, so the story, so I joined this company at 15 people. We eventually grew it to about 35 people, and I left. This was the dot-com era, towards the end of the 90s, and I was offered all these stock options by this software company called Keyfile. So I jumped to go see what that was all about. Um, we sold Keyfile in 2002. I came back into the GovCon space kind of post 9/11 and worked for a company called Vredenburg. Vredenburg got purchased by American Management Systems. American Management Systems got purchased by CGI and CACI. They kind of split the company in two. And then I got a phone call from Dick Stiglitz. I'd been gone from RGS for 6 years. And he said, "Hey, Dyson, I want you to come back to RGS." And to be honest, I kind of thought I'd outgrown him. I'd moved on and done these other things. I've been involved in mergers and acquisitions and worked for these big companies. Um, and he basically said, "We haven't grown since you left. I need you to come back, grow this company so that I can retire, and then you guys can run the company." So that was pretty appealing. So I went back to RGS in 2004, 6 years after I had left. We put all this in writing, and we ultimately got to the point 2 years later where Dick could get his number. Every owner's got a number, right?
Every owner has a number.
We got Dick to his number. We went to market. We were originally just going to sell the company so he could take the money and go. And then we got introduced to a private equity firm. The only thing I'd ever heard about private equity is they were money grubbing, nasty people who came in and told you how to run your company. So I wasn't very interested in that. But we met them. CM Equity Partners is the name of the private equity firm that we were introduced to, a guy named Peter Schulte. And I was blown away. Like, I really understood our business. He wanted to be our partner. He wasn't going to help run the company. He was going to be there to support our vision of the company. So private equity money came in. We wrote a check to Dick. Dick had retired, went and wrote a couple of books, and became an M&A aficionado, on the speaking tour, talking to small businesses about how to sell their company. And then we ran RGS for 10 more years, and we exited
Were,
that company in 2017.
were you an owner of RJS in that second round?
Yes. Actually, I was owner in the first round. When I first got there, about a year into my time there, I said, "Is there any way that we can contribute to be part of," and I didn't even understand the word equity at the point, but to be part owner in this thing. And we put together, it wasn't an ESOP, but it was an employee stock purchase program. So every month or every paycheck, I would put money in my 401k and I would put money in RGS stock. So when I actually left that first time in 1998 to go to Keyfile, I was about a 8% owner of the company.
Very cool. Okay, so when you went back, I assume you sold when you had to leave when you left RGM the first time.
Yeah.
You then went back. It was Dick's company. He owned whatever percentage he owned. He then sold, and the PE came in. Did you invest alongside with the PE, CM Capital, or was it basically stock options that you received?
Yeah, so the stock purchase program that we put in place earlier was still in place. So as soon as I came back in 2004, I bought as much stock as I could because I knew that we were going to be the owners of the company eventually. So when Dick sold to the private equity firm, CM Equity Partners, he was a 65% owner and the employees owned 35. And then that converted into stock, in the new platform once CM Equity invested.
Got it. Okay, so now you're there. You've had lots of experience working in a variety of GovCon companies where you might have been an owner of up to 8% in one, but now you're the man at the helm. What was that like?
It was scary. When I say,
Yeah, it's scary. People say, "Oh yeah, the CEO job is so much fun. You're going to do this and that." It's a scary job.
let me be clear. I was not CEO of that company. I was executive vice president. I was the number two guy, right?
Hmm.
So a Navy friend of mine, Tom McMahon, was the president and CEO, and I was the executive vice president. Essentially, he ran the back office, and I ran service delivery and worked with customers. That was kind of how we split up the duties. Um, yeah, it's a scary because when you're not in charge, you have all these ideas about what those guys should be doing, right? And then all of a sudden you're those guys, right? And you've got to execute on those things. Um, so yeah, it was scary. It was challenging. It was interesting. It was, um, it set me on the course to the person I am today.
Now, there's really three parts of having a company. You've got to get the work, you've got to do the work, and then you've got to deal with the back office. I just heard your partner basically dealing with the back office. Were you doing the getting the work as well as delivering on the work?
Correct.
Wow. Okay. So you were completely involved in the business development and the operations side of things.
Exactly.
How did you look at the company and say, we're going to grow this thing? Where are the room for growth? How did you think about growth at that point? Now, particularly since you are one of the two people in the hot seat.
Yeah, one thing I learned along the way, and what I did differently at CB on Data, the company I just left, RGS was what I would call a program management contractor, right? We ran programs for customers. The Navy was our biggest client. We were able to leverage some of the work we did at the Navy to get into the Department of Justice, and we got into Homeland Security. We got into ICE and Secret Service. But it was leveraging what I would call a pedestrian offering. We weren't highly differentiated from our competitors. So it tended to be writing a really good proposal, having some brand awareness within the customer set, right? We were very well known in the Navy, and over time, we had gotten some notoriety within the Department of Justice and within Department of Homeland Security, and you had to be at a really good price. So we took over the company. It was a $12 million company. Over 10 years, we grew from 12 million to 35 million, and that's where we were when we sold. Not historic growth, but decent growth. I mean, we increased the value of the company.
It
We were
sounds
able
to me like you
to,
basically tripled the size of the company or close to tripling it in a 10-year period of time.
essentially.
Okay.
Um, and got to a size where we were interesting to the market, where we could move the needle for certain types of customers, and we went to market and sold the company. When I walked away from that, and the numbers weren't as large as I might have hoped 2 years or 10 years earlier, I said, I'm going to do it different next time. Next time I take a job in a leadership role in GovCon, I'm going to find a company that's very differentiated, right? That doesn't have to rely on price to win. That's what I did in
Okay.
data.
Um, Now let's go to the company that I think probably other people have heard of, See Beyond Data. First of all, I love the name, the way in which it was spelled out, et cetera. Did you form that company or did you acquire that?
Neither. So I met CBN. Well, actually, so let me back up. It's a good story about that. The original name of CBN Data was DCS Consulting. DCS Consulting were the three initials of the founder, Dave Schmednick. And
Terrible name.
I met Dave Schmednick. Yeah, pretty pedestrian, right? I met Dave at the U.S. Marshal Service. CBN Data was a 5-person company, and Dave was at the Marshal Service as the founder, developing deliverables for his client. Great small business. He and I became fast friends. And I became kind of an informal mentor to CBN Data as it grew. So as he went from 5 employees to 10 employees, or 10 employees to 20 employees, I would get a phone call and he'd say, hey, somebody just asked me for a teaming agreement. What is that? And I'd tell him what a teaming agreement was all about. And I'd typically email him mine and say, take my logo off and put your logo on it. Now that's your teaming agreement. So after about 6 or 7 years of doing that with Dave, CBN Data, the original company, was founded in 2011. Fast forward, CBN Data had grown to about a $15 million company, and I got a phone call at my house during COVID. And Dave's like, hey, I'm thinking of selling the company. Can you help me? Because we had just gone through it. We had just sold RGS. And I said, sure, I'll do anything I can to help. So he sent me his deck, and it was terrible. It had all the wrong stuff in it, right? It was talking about technology, and here's how we developed our software, and here's how we did this. I'm like, they don't care about that. They care about growth. They care about EBITDA. They care about those types of things. So we reworked it. And a couple weeks later, he called me and he said, hey, what do you think about private equity? I said, well, hey, it worked really well at RGS. He was a relatively young guy. You could sell part of your company, continue to run it, and then, have a second exit at some point in the future. He's like, okay, that sounds pretty interesting. He's like, but I don't want to be the CEO. Would you consider being the CEO? So that's how it started. So he and I chatted. He was a tech guy. He was somebody who liked working with the customer, delivering solutions. As the company got bigger, more and more of his time was spent working with the bank, working on invoices, working on back office kinds of things, and it was driving him crazy. So he brought me in January of 21 to take over as CEO so that he could be the chief solutions officer. And then he and I ran the company as partners from there on.
So interesting. As an M&A advisor, I see so many business owners who are subject matter experts. They know their areas so incredibly well, but they don't have any idea how to get the business. And it's simply a frustration for them of, if the government would just give me this to do, I could do an excellent job at a really good price. But there's a special skill involved in simply getting the work itself. That's very hard to outsource to somebody else. So it's kind of the job of the CEO. How did you go about seeing growth for CBeyond Data?
Yeah, I mean, when I got there in January of 21, my job essentially was to mature the company, right? To go from a spreadsheet to a full-blown pipeline, to run it through the gates, right? To start having more of a formal process by which we develop proposals, we approved the ones that made sense, we got in front of the customer and did solutioning. If we hadn't gotten in front of the customer, we didn't bid on it, right? So it was kind of taking it from a small startup that was kind of scrappy to a more mature, methodical organization. And remember, I mentioned private equity. We still weren't a private equity-backed company. We were a small business in early 2021, and we started to work with Bluestone Investment Partners. So Bluestone was interested in investing in CBeyond Data, but one of their prerequisites was they wanted to see if we could sell the software we developed to a government customer. We'd done lots of demos. We had a lot of interest. We'd gone to conferences and showed off this software. It's called the CFO Control Tower, but we had never sold it.
I would think
A
that
lot
would be
of
a significant factor for somebody investing in the company. Great that you've got this technology, but is there any customer that wants to buy it?
Exactly. So that was a lot of focus in the early days, in early 21, was to get to the point where someone in the government would write a contract to buy that software and get it implemented. So our first customer was the Department of Justice. We closed that deal in May of that year, and then we closed the deal with Bluestone in August. So then we
So
became
Bluestone was willing to go forward with an investment after having one purchase because they were so convinced of the strength of this software.
absolutely.
Was it software? Was it SaaS? What exactly did your data do? Did your software do?
So CFO Control Tower is basically a data warehouse in a box for a CFO in the federal government, right? So it allows them to take the financial data from whatever ERP systems they're running, so whether it's Oracle or Momentum or SAP, put it into a data warehouse to allow them to create their own reports, right? So I can have dashboards and reports and automations based on that data without customizing the core ERP. So that's in essence what it is. So what Department of Justice has done is they put a BPA in place with Justice Management Division, which is kind of the headquarters of the Department of Justice, that would allow any component within the Department of Justice to be able to implement the software. And they called it JEDI, the Justice Enterprise Data Integration System.
Okay. Somebody who's a Star Wars fan, I'm willing to bet.
Yeah.
Okay, you sell this to the FBI, then what happens? This is now still 2021.
Yeah. So the thesis that we agreed on with Bluestone was, okay, CBeyond Data knew the Department of Justice really well. They happened to be on the Momentum platform, so we were experts in the Momentum platform, but we were not experts in SAP and Oracle, which are the other two major ERPs in federal government. So the private equity bolt-on acquisition strategy was, let's find a customer or a company that has the SAP background and that has the Oracle background. So we kind of looked out to the market and started looking at who's winning those kind of contracts, what type of business that we could afford that would be a natural bolt-on to what CBeyond Data is doing. The first company we came across was a company called Altavia Consulting. Altavia was a woman-owned small business who had a big footprint in the Army, and that's an SAP customer, and had been doing SAP work. So they had about 150 employees. Many of them were SAP subject matter experts. So it's kind of perfect, but now we had to come to a deal. We had to not only figure out how much we're going to pay for the company, but we had to convince them we were the right home for them. right? They had a lot of interest from a lot of different companies.
Were they on the market at the time, or were you approaching them as kind of a proprietary deal?
Now they were on the market.
Okay, so you were actually then in a competitive process with other potential buyers. What were the arguments you made to say, hey, money is important, and hopefully we're going to meet the money that other people are going to offer, but you should come to us. We we're prettier. What is it about you that you said you were able to convince them to do that?
I think it goes back to the beginning. We had a thesis, we had a plan, a strategic plan about how we were going to go from this $15 million company to something much greater that has bigger impact. There were three founders of Altavia Consulting, and they were all interested in continuing working. They weren't looking to sell their company and go live on an island somewhere. And we really found where they could contribute to the greater organization. So it kind of lucky part of it, we filled gaps that they had. They didn't have a business development department. They didn't write
Oh,
proposals. A lot of their work was as a subcontractor. So the customers would want their expertise and they would hand money to a large integrator and say, send this to Altavia Consulting.
so
Right.
you were buying them really for the capacity, for the capability that they had in SAP, something that your firm didn't have, as well as for entry into a new client that you didn't have.
Absolutely. Yeah, they brought a big
Absolutely.
anchor client, and they built their anchor client in the Army almost exactly the way we built our anchor client in the Department of Justice, right? They got into one part and then they cross-sold and moved into another organization and moved into another organization. So they had a large footprint, not one contract, but like 6 different contracts in the Army, which is exactly the kind of blocking and tackling that we like to do as well. So we fit.
Absolutely. That's the one for the first of 2 acquisitions, wasn't it? Did you do a second one?
It is. So we spent like a year integrating the 2 companies, making sure that we um, felt good operating together, that we were all on the same platforms. We moved our accounting system, we moved our pipeline management system. We made sure that the SAP components were built into the CFO control tower and started selling that into the environment. And then we lifted our heads up and said, okay, time to look for the next one. And the next one was a company called Summit to Sea. We actually met them before they went to market and tried to convince them to do a proprietary deal with us. It was close, but they wanted to go to market anyway. But we really had a leg up. I mean, just like you go in to get to know customers, we really knew Summit to See what they were all about, what their customers looked like, what their contracts looked like. So we had an advantage. So they did go through a competitive process, but we ended up being the one that they chose. And we acquired that company about a year after we acquired Altavia.
How important was having a PE backer to you enabling you to do those 2 acquisitions?
I was immense. I couldn't have done it without. Um, I had participated in M&A transactions. I had never done one, right? All of the documentation you have to go through, setting up the data rooms, doing the due diligence, having the banking relationships to be able to put together the financing to make these things work. Bluestone was a master at that, right? So I really leaned into them a lot. They would come back to me with like, hey, here's what this says. We need to go right or we need to go left. And I'd be involved in those decisions, but I didn't have to have a team inside CBON Data doing all that work.
It's a huge difference. Okay, so you finish the second acquisition. I assume you do an integration. What happened to the growth of the company? You started off at what level? Where were you by the end of the second acquisition?
Let me see. So we were at about 120 million at the end of the second acquisition. So
Okay,
all
so
total, start to finish was about 4.5 years between me starting with Dave Schmednick as the CEO and exiting at the beginning of 2025. We went from 15 million when I started to nearly 150 million when we sold the company. About 50% of that growth was organic and 50% was inorganic, right? So we were buying revenue. These companies came with contracts and they came with revenue already, but the synergy of having those 3 companies together gave us bigger past performances to be able to leverage within our proposals, gives us access to new customers we'd never met before. We got really lucky with Summit to See. They were a leader in the Oracle space, specifically DAI, the Defense Agencies Initiative, and that implementation of Oracle, which is a big shared service in the DoD. So through their experience implementing DAI, we basically had access to everybody in DoD. Where
Phenomenal.
we'd just gotten our foot into the Army, and now we had access to everybody else in DoD, legacy customers who had existing contracts. And they had stood up this program in OSD called Advana. And Advana was a huge, basically data warehouse. So right up our alley, data analytics. Advana is all about collecting the data from all of the services and the fourth estate, putting it in a place that it can be seen, leveraged, viewed, manipulated. And they were one of the anchor subcontractors to Booz Allen, who was the prime on that endeavor.
So, okay, so you finished the second acquisition, and what was the time period between completing the second acquisition and going to market with CBeyond Data to sell the company?
A year and a half.
Okay, so what happened during that year and a half?
We continued to grow. We knew that we had to have, a good implementation of the CFO Control Tower, not just in justice, but in additional organizations. We needed to do a lot of documentation. We were thinking ahead on the data room, right? We had to have all the things that a prospective buyer would want to see in a $150 million company in a data room. We were working on our pipeline. Right after we bought Summit to See, I brought on our first chief growth officer. We got into a size where we really needed the heft of a chief growth officer who could manage that on a day-to-day. And I found a great one that I worked with before. We were trying to figure out what is the ideal acquirer of CBeyond Data. Who would be able to be kind of that 1 + 1 + 1 = 5 adder. Right. And it was interesting because we were debating about, is it another private equity? Is it just a larger private equity than Bluestone that can kind of take us to the next level? Or is there a strategic that would make a lot of sense for CBeyond Data? So there's a lot
What
of
ended up happening?
It ended up being the strategic that was our choice.
Okay.
We were acquired by
you felt like you were acquired by who?
SMX.
Oh, yes. Okay. Great company. All right. So I'm hearing a lot of M&A. I'm hearing selling companies. I'm hearing buying companies. Let's talk about being in the process of buying a company. What were the concerns that you had when you were trying to buy a company? Somebody expressed to me, hey, listen, we all talk about the sellers being nervous about selling their company, but buyers are the ones who are taking millions of dollars out of their pocket and in some ways putting their reputation on the line saying, I think I can make this successful. And that buyers can be very nervous during that process. Were you? How did you think about buying companies?
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing for me is really we're buying expertise. We're buying people, quite honestly. People's, not just brain power, but their heart, right? They've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into whatever organization they've been working for, and now you're asking them to, kind of sign up to be that committed to your organization. And I think the keys to that, one was we had a strategic plan. We could convey what it was. We're trying to go here. You guys are a key component to enable us to be able to go, to the place we're trying to go. Being very open, being very genuine, making sure that they understood what we were trying to do, that they didn't feel like they might want to mistrust us. Right? Back to my original thought about private equity, that there are a bunch of people that are just out for money and they don't really understand the organization. And then there's a group of people, really the leaders of all three companies, CBeyond Data, Altavia Consulting, and Summit to See, that you want to share in the success, right? So we did put in place option programs and something called a sidecar where people could actually invest their own money in this entity that we were building.
Almost like your stock purchase plan from your first company.
Very simple.
Okay, you also worked with two different PE firms. Did you find that there was a difference between CM Equity and Bluestone, or was working with private equity pretty much the same?
Now, it was a little bit different. I enjoyed both of them, and I would highly recommend both of those PE firms. When I worked with CM Equity, I liked at the time that they were from New York, not the Northern Virginia area. So I would see them maybe once a quarter when they would come down for a board meeting or something like that. But they weren't operators, right? They were money people. They understood the books. They understood the financial dynamics of the market, but they didn't know what it took to write a proposal. They didn't know what it meant to develop a deliverable and give it to a customer. Um, so I got the financial education I needed from them, but I really didn't get any value out on the delivery side on how to run a government contracting company.
Hmm.
Um, Bluestone stepped it up, right? I never thought I'd find somebody better than CM Equity until I met Bluestone. And then with Bluestone, the operators in Bluestone had run companies in GovCon before, right? So they had sat in my seat. So I was able to have a mano a mano kind of conversation with them about, I'm struggling with this, or how do I make this work? Or how do I get better integration outcomes? And they were able to give me really good advice. Uh,
It's really important that, yes, they're both private equity. Yes, they're both wonderful firms with really good people, but different private equity firms have different orientations. How actively engaged in the business are they? Are they former operators? Are this just a financial play for them? What level of control and discretion will the management have under PE? So those are all big questions that people need to be thinking about when they're thinking about selling, particularly if they're going to be staying with the company.
Absolutely.
Okay. So when you finished the second acquisition, you sold a year and a half later, that would indicate to me that you knew that you were going to be going to market soon, as evidenced by the fact that you said we needed to start preparing the documentation and all the rest of that. How many people did you bring into the circle who knew that you were going to be bringing CBeyond data to the market?
Well, there were phases of that process. So my executive leadership team was 6 people. So it was founders from all 3 companies, myself, the CEO or CFO, and and we had an executive chairman who was kind of a part-time person. So those 6 people, we met every Thursday from 4 to 6 o'clock to talk about strategic issues. No tactical issues, just strategic issues. How are we going to get to where we want to go? And we did that for months and months and months. So that was the original team that kind of said, are we ready to start thinking about going down this path? So it was 6 originally. We interviewed investment bankers to try and figure out who might take us to market. We actually did something kind of unusual, I think. We ended up hiring 2 of them, and they were kind of in a front seat, back seat kind of arrangement where they both helped us.
Talk about that a little bit. You worked with both wonderful firms, but why did you choose both of them as opposed to one of them? And what were the firms? We can promote their names.
Well, one of them has actually been purchased recently. So it was G Squared. G Squared was purchased by Piper six or
Ricker
eight.
Sandler
Yeah. Um,
recently, otherwise known as the Gregs.
right. Yeah. So I had known the Gregs for a long time.
They're wonderful.
They had a certain skill set that we really admired, and then Kip Sasanta was the other firm who also had a very great skill set and had an amazing network, right? There's basically nobody in the M&A world that they're not related to or connected to. So we just felt in the end, we liked a lot about both of them, and we thought together they would be really strong as long as they could work well together, and they assured me they could. And so we hired them both. And they worked together as teammates all the way through the process, from the original teaser through the SIP, through the management presentations, through closing. It was an excellent team, and we got the outcome we were looking for.
But going through the process, what were you thinking about yourself? That is, were you thinking that you were going to stay with the company for indefinitely, a limited period of time, or leave upon the closing?
I committed to everybody that I would stay to make sure that everybody was taken care of, right? That the integration went well, that the benefits got merged, that, there wasn't some sort of synergies taking place. Um, so I committed, I didn't know how long that would take. In the end, it took 10 months. So I stayed 10 months after close. And I felt comfortable that SMX had done everything they promised to do, that they were the right place for our firm, and things were on a good trajectory, and then I could step back and hand over to a new leader.
Okay, so you're stepping back and you're saying to yourself, what am I going to do when I grow up? Sitting there, you don't have a job, I'm not sure you needed a job, but you've got all of these skills. What were you thinking at that point? Did you think about why don't I just start a company? Why don't I buy a company? What did you do and why did you do that?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to start anything from scratch. That was for sure. So it was kind of, do I do the CB on data model again, find a company that I could step in and help run, and then kind of run the playbook again? Or, and I actually didn't consider this originally, but I was approached by Foxstead Partners about a potential opportunity with them. And they said, hey, instead of you just doing that for one company, what if you could do that for a whole portfolio of companies? Um, so I played those two off for a couple of weeks against each other in my mind, about which I might enjoy. Um, and Foxstead won because it was something different, right? It wasn't rinse and repeat. It wasn't just going and rerunning the playbook that I did at CB on Data for another 5 years with a different company. It was different challenges. I was setting something up from scratch. This private equity firm has not done this before, so I'm setting up the structures, I'm setting up the playbooks, I'm setting up the thesis about the types of companies that we're interested in looking at to help make them successful so that they can have positive outcomes like CB on Data did.
So tell me the thesis of Foxstead. What kind of companies are they looking for? Are they doing majority, minority, combination? What, tell me about Foxstead.
Yeah, so we are going to be minority investors in $5 to $50 million companies that have something unique, that are not the run-of-the-mill company, right? That have something unique to offer the market, where we think we can take them from being an immature company and help them set up all the structures to be a more mature, larger company that will ultimately bring a higher return.
Now, part of the classic on that in GovCon, of course, is that the smaller companies tend to be in the set-aside market. And then as they size out, they get into the other than small and that dreaded middle market kind of area. Do you have kind of a playbook for how people get into the full and open market?
There are strategies. I wouldn't say there is a playbook, but there are certainly strategies to get there. And it's what we did with CB on Data. CB on Data was a woman-owned small business. Ironically, both acquisitions we did were also woman-owned small businesses. So all three companies that eventually came together were woman-owned small businesses. But we had the value add to get customers past that. We had the relationships that allowed customers to get past that. It was more important for them to get CB on Data or to get the CFO Control Tower or to have the access to the SAP engineers that Altavia had or the Oracle engineers that Summit to C had than it was to get a check in a box or get closer to their quota in a given small business category.
So with kind of going back to your thesis of it needs to be differentiated. They need to be hiring us for that differentiated work, and the designation then does not become a major concern.
Right. Now, it's
Were
not to
there
say we
people?
didn't lose some, I mean, some of the contracts had to fall away. We had a two-person contract at the EEOC. There was a small business set aside, and we couldn't convince them not to. And so there's small business probably doing that work today. But the major muscle movements, the major contracts that we had are all still in place today as unrestricted contracts.
One of the things that I've said to business owners, and I'd love to hear if you please disagree with me, is that if you can see the size out coming, if it's going to be in 5 years, 6 years, whatever, you've got to be making a very serious decision as to whether or not you're going to bring your company up until that size standard and just stay there, or whether or not you're going to go beyond that. And that in order to go beyond that, you can't wait until you're at the size standard. You need to be starting that years in advance, knowing that you're probably not going to win the first several contracts that you bid on. Now, as somebody who's actually led the P&L, what do you think about that? Is that a waste of money to be bidding on things that you think you're not going to win?
Oh, absolutely not. You learn a ton every time. Every time you get a debrief, every time you see what the others in the market are doing, whether it's price wise or strategy wise, to get that work, you're learning something. So yeah, I think it's a 3 year, depending on your trajectory, 3 years before you're going to graduate, you need to be bidding unrestricted contracts in customers that you're not fluent in. The other strategy, to give you a little piece of the playbook, is go to your best customer while you're still a small business and tell them to put the recompete out unrestricted. If you're good, if your customer loves you, if you've got exceptional CPARs, you're going to win it anyway and start getting used to winning unrestricted contracts. Dave Schmednick, the founder of CB on Data, had a great mentor years ago that told him to do that. When I joined the company at 15 million, they were only 50% set aside work. The other 50% was already unrestricted.
Really, a 50% full and open for a $15 million company is a rare profile. So that's pretty impressive.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now you're on this new adventure. Um, you're going to have for these portfolio companies. I assume that there would be somebody like you in each one of these companies, and that you would be there as an advisor or a guide to help them, learn from your experience. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you looking for companies to do a minority investment only where the management is looking to stay, or would you replace management as well?
We could do either one. We certainly have a stable of relationships of people who are experts in doing these kinds of things. Um, so yeah, if the owners wanted to go away and had done their 20 or 30 or 40 years and were ready to hang it up, certainly we could bring in a new management team and have the same kind of relationship with them.
Is the reason for only doing minority investments to avoid affiliation concerns, particularly in the smaller deals where there might be some set aside concerns?
That's exactly right.
Okay. So in some ways, it sounds a little bit like the Blue Delta playbook from 15 years ago. But now Blue Delta has gone up market. They don't want to do a deal for less than cutting a check for 15 million for 40% of the company. You can do the math. Those are pretty big companies already. I heard you say 5 million to 50 million. Was that revenue or EBITDA?
Revenue.
Million of revenue. So you're talking potentially about very small companies that you think have a real opportunity to grow.
Exactly. And we're going to be very
Exactly.
selective. This isn't the first time that this firm that I've joined has done this. But I would say in their growing up years, every deal was a good deal.
Hmm.
Uh, they brought me on to be a little more discerning, right? To actually implement investment committee processes, to look at lots of opportunities. 90% of them we won't pursue, but to find those diamonds in the rough, those 10% that we want to pursue and get behind. And
Very
we put it
interesting.
in.
Well, Dyson, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk today. I'm wishing you all the best in this new venture. I think it's really needed in the market, and we look forward to working with you on that.